Xavier Irving stood in his back pasture watching blood stain the Texas grass. And for a moment, he thought death had come to visit his land again. The doe lay on her side, her brown coat matted with crimson, one delicate leg bent at an angle that made his stomach twist. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements, and her dark eyes rolled with panic when she caught sight of him. Xavier had seen enough suffering in his 32 years, first in the war and then during the fever that took his parents, but something about this creature's helplessness struck him differently. He approached slowly, speaking in low tones, the same voice he used with his horses when thunder rolled across the plains. The animal tried to scramble away but collapsed with a sound that was almost human in its pain. Xavier knelt in the dirt, examining the wound. A bullet had grazed her hindquarter, likely a stray shot from hunters passing through his property without permission. The leg appeared badly sprained or possibly broken where she had fallen. He had no business trying to save a wild deer. The practical thing would be to put her down, to end her suffering quickly and be done with it. But Xavier had put down enough living things in his life, and on this particular morning in September of 1878, he found he did not have the heart for it. The problem was he knew nothing about treating wild animals. He could set a horse's leg or treat a cow for bloat, but deer were different creatures entirely, skittish and prone to dying from shock alone. He needed help, and there was only one person in Truth or Consequences, Texas, who might have the knowledge he required. Laura Jensen had arrived in town 3 months prior, a woman alone with a wagon full of books and medical supplies, which had set every tongue wagging from the saloon to the church steps. She had taken up residence in a small house on the edge of town and hung a shingle that read "Animal Doctor" in neat black letters. The ranchers had laughed at first. A woman veterinarian was absurd enough, but one who charged the same rates as Doc Hendricks charged for people was downright offensive to their sensibilities. Xavier had never met her, never had cause to, but he had heard the talk. Some said she was a widow. Others claimed she was running from something back east. A few of the more charitable ladies at church suggested she was simply educated beyond what was proper for a woman and had nowhere else to go. Whatever the truth, she was his only option. He could not move the doe himself without causing more damage, so he rode hard into town, his gelding's hooves throwing up dust on the dry road. Truth or Consequences shimmered in the late morning heat, the wooden buildings bleached pale by the relentless sun. He found Laura Jensen's house easily enough, a white clapboard structure with a small barn out back. Before he could knock, the door opened, and he found himself face to face with a woman who immediately derailed every thought in his head. She was perhaps 25, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid, and eyes the color of creek water in summer. She wore a simple brown dress with the sleeves rolled up, and there was a smudge of something that looked like salve on her cheek. But it was her expression that caught him, intelligent and assessing, meeting his gaze directly in a way that most women in Truth or Consequences had been taught to avoid. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice was clear and Eastern, touched with an accent he could not quite place. "I am Xavier Irving. I have a wounded doe on my property about 3 miles out. Gunshot wound and possibly a broken leg. I know it is unusual, but I am willing to pay whatever you ask if you can help her." Laura tilted her head slightly, studying him with those remarkable eyes. Most ranchers would simply shoot a wounded deer and be done with it. "Yes, madam, but I am not most ranchers." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Give me 10 minutes to gather my supplies." "You will need to lead me there." She moved with efficient purpose, disappearing into her house and emerging with 2 large bags and a box of instruments. Xavier helped her load everything into his wagon, which he had the foresight to bring along. She climbed up onto the seat beside him without waiting for assistance, and they set off toward his ranch. The ride gave him the opportunity to observe her more closely. She sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes scanned the landscape with keen interest. She seemed to notice everything: a hawk circling overhead, wildflowers growing in stubborn patches along the roadside, the way the heat made the air dance above the ground. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, breaking the silence. "It was my father's before me. I have been running it alone for 2 years now, since the fever took both my parents. I am sorry for your loss." The words were simple but genuine, and Xavier found himself saying, "Thank you, and your own story, if you do not mind my asking." Laura was quiet for a moment, and he thought perhaps he had overstepped, but then she spoke, her voice steady. "I studied veterinary medicine in Philadelphia. My father was a physician and believed that all his children should be educated, daughters included. When he died, my brother inherited everything and made it clear that my presence was no longer welcome. So I came west, where people are desperate enough for help that they might overlook my gender." There was no bitterness in her words, only a frank assessment of reality that Xavier respected. "For what it is worth, I do not care if you are a man or a woman, so long as you can help that doe." This time she did smile, a quick flash of warmth. "Then let us hope I am as good as I believe myself to be." The doe was worse when they arrived, her breathing more labored, her eyes glazed with shock. Laura dropped to her knees beside the animal without hesitation, her hands moving over the wound with practiced skill. Xavier watched as she worked, amazed by her calm competence. She spoke to the deer in a low, soothing voice while she examined the injuries, her fingers gentle but thorough. "The bullet wound is not deep, thankfully. It has bled considerably but missed anything vital. The leg is badly sprained but not broken, which is fortunate. She is in shock, though, and dehydrated. We need to move her somewhere sheltered and quiet. Do you have a barn stall we can use?" "Yes, but how do we move her without making things worse?" Very carefully. Laura pulled a small brown bottle from her bag. "This is laudanum. Not ideal for animals, but in small doses it will calm her enough to transport. Help me get a few drops into her mouth." Working together, they managed to administer the medicine. Within minutes, the doe's frantic movements slowed, her breathing evening out slightly. Xavier fetched an old canvas tarp and spread it beside the animal. Together, they carefully rolled her onto it, then carried her between them to the barn. Laura directed him to a corner stall, well away from his 2 horses, and they settled the doe onto a thick bed of clean straw. For the next several hours, Xavier watched as Laura worked. She cleaned and dressed the bullet wound with steady hands, applied a poultice that smelled of herbs he could not name, and fashioned a splint for the injured leg using strips of cloth and light wooden slats. She examined the doe's eyes and gums, listened to her breathing, and finally sat back on her heels with a satisfied nod. She has a fighting chance now. The next few days will tell us whether she has the will to survive. Wild animals can die from the stress of captivity alone, but if we keep her calm and quiet, she may pull through. Xavier realized the sun had moved significantly across the sky. "You have been here for hours. Let me fix you some supper at least." Laura looked at him for a long moment, clearly weighing the propriety of accepting. Finally, she nodded. "That would be welcome, thank you, but then I will need to return to town before dark. I have other patients to check on." His house was modest, a 4-room structure that his father had built with his own hands. Xavier was suddenly conscious of how plain it was, how lacking in feminine touches.
This story
His
was
mother's
posted on the
curtains still
channel The
hung in the
Rusty
windows,
Saddle. Please do
faded
not
now,
repost it in
and
any
dust had
form.
gathered on surfaces he rarely thought to clean. But Laura did not seem to notice or care. She washed her hands at the pump outside while he built up the fire in the stove and began preparing a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread. "You cook?" she asked, settling into a chair at the table. "I have no choice, living alone." "It is not fancy, but it is edible. That is more than many men can claim." She accepted the plate he offered her and ate with good appetite, clearly unbothered by the rustic fare. "Tell me about your ranch. What do you raise?" "Cattle mostly, though I keep a few horses as well." "It is a small operation compared to some of the spreads around here, but it provides a living. What about you? Do you enjoy your work?" Her face lit up in a way that transformed her entirely. "I love it. Animals are honest in a way that people often are not. They do not care about your family name or your bank account, or whether you wear the right kind of dress. If you treat them with skill and kindness, they respond in kind. There is something deeply satisfying about healing a creature that cannot even understand you are trying to help." Xavier found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her passion. "Is that why you wanted to be a veterinarian? Because of that honesty?" "Partly. But mostly because I was never content to simply watch while my father worked. I wanted to understand, to help, to do something meaningful with my hands and my mind. Society has very narrow ideas about what women should do, but I discovered early on that I could not fit myself into that mold." She paused, meeting his eyes. "Does that shock you?" "No," he said honestly. "I think it makes you brave." Color touched her cheeks, and she looked down at her plate. The moment stretched between them, weighted with something Xavier could not quite name but felt nonetheless. After supper, he drove her back to town, the wagon rattling over the rutted road as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. They spoke of small things: the weather, the town, the challenges of making a living in Texas. But beneath the ordinary words, Xavier felt a connection forming, a recognition that perhaps they were not so different after all. Both of them were alone, both trying to make their way in a world that did not quite know what to do with them. When they reached her house, Laura gathered her bags and turned to him. "I will need to check on the dough daily for at least a week. I can drive myself out if you can provide directions." "Nonsense. I will come fetch you each morning. It is the least I can do." "That is not necessary. You have your own work to do." "Miss Jensen, I insist. The roads can be dangerous for a woman alone." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I have managed thus far." Xavier realized his mistake. "I did not mean to imply you could not take care of yourself. I only thought it might be easier and it would give me peace of mind. But if you prefer to come on your own, I will respect that." Laura studied him for a moment, then her expression softened. "No, you are right. It would be foolish to refuse help out of pure stubbornness. I will be ready at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." True to her word, she was waiting on her porch when he arrived the next day. The routine they established felt natural: the quiet morning ride to his ranch, the careful examination of their patient, the hours spent in companionable work. The dough improved slowly. By the third day, she was eating small amounts of grass and clover that Laura gathered from the fields. By the fifth day, she was attempting to stand, though Laura cautioned against letting her put too much weight on the healing leg. Xavier found excuses to linger in the barn while Laura worked, fascinated by her knowledge and her gentle touch. She taught him things: how to read an animal's eyes for signs of pain, which herbs could reduce inflammation, the proper way to change a dressing. But more than that, they talked. Long, rambling conversations that ranged from philosophy to politics, to the simple pleasures of a good sunset. He learned that she was 24 years old, that her mother had died when she was 12, that she had two brothers and a sister who thought her choices scandalous. She loved reading, particularly adventure novels, and had a weakness for peppermint candy. She missed the ocean, which she had seen exactly once on a trip to the coast, and sometimes dreamed of traveling to places she had only read about in books. In turn, she drew stories from him that he had not shared with anyone. He told her about the war, where he had served as a cavalry scout at 17, too young and too idealistic to understand what he was getting into. He spoke of his parents, his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce love. He even told her about the loneliness of running the ranch alone, the way silence could become oppressive when it was all you had. On the 10th day, Laura declared the doe well enough to be released. The animal had regained her strength, and the leg had healed remarkably well, thanks to Laura's skilled care. They walked her out to the pasture together, supporting her between them, and then stepped back to watch as she took her first tentative steps toward freedom. The doe paused at the edge of the tree line, turning to look back at them with those dark, liquid eyes. Then she bounded away, disappearing into the scrub oak and mesquite. Laura pressed her hand to her chest, and Xavier saw tears shining in her eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, laughing a little. "I just never tire of this feeling, of knowing that something lives that might have died." Xavier understood then that he was in serious danger of falling in love with this woman. Perhaps he was already halfway there, had been since the moment she knelt in the dirt beside a wounded animal without caring what it did to her dress. The realization should have terrified him, but instead it felt like relief, like something locked inside him had finally opened. "Will you stay for supper?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Laura turned to look at him, and something in her expression suggested she understood what he was really asking. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that." This time he had prepared more carefully. There was a roast chicken, vegetables from his garden, and bread that had actually risen properly. He had cleaned the house and put wildflowers on the table, feeling foolish but doing it anyway. Laura noticed everything, her eyes lighting up with pleasure. "Xavier, this is wonderful. You went to so much trouble. I wanted to thank you properly, for everything you did for the doe and for teaching me so much these past 10 days. He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Also, I confess I have enjoyed your company more than I have enjoyed anything in a very long time. And I was hoping that perhaps we might continue to see each other, even though our patient no longer requires care." Laura set down her fork carefully. "Are you courting me, Mr. Irving?" "I am trying to, Miss Jensen. Not very smoothly, I admit, but yes." "I see." She was quiet for a moment, and Xavier's heart sank. Then she smiled, that beautiful warm smile that made his chest ache. "I should tell you that I have no intention of giving up my practice. If we were to pursue this, you would need to understand that I will always work, that my calling is not something I can set aside. I would never ask you to. Your work is part of who you are, and who you are is exactly who I want." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm and strong. "Then yes, I would very much like for us to continue seeing each other." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Xavier had imagined. Laura was not content to sit in parlors and make polite conversation. Instead, they worked together, riding out to check on his cattle, repairing fences, tending his garden. She taught him more about animal husbandry than he had learned in years of ranching, and he showed her the hidden corners of his land, the places where deer came to drink at dusk, and wildflowers grew in improbable profusion. They attended church together on Sundays, enduring the whispers and sidelong glances from townspeople who could not quite understand their relationship. Laura held her head high, and Xavier walked beside her with pride. Let them talk. He had found something real, and he would not
This
apologize
story
for it.
was posted on the channel The
In
Rusty
October,
Saddle.
the
Please do
first
not
cold
repost it
snap
in any form.
arrived, bringing with it a different kind of urgency. Xavier's cattle needed to be driven to better grazing, his barn needed repairs before winter, and there were a dozen other tasks that required attention. Laura helped where she could, but she also had her own work. A rancher 10 miles out had a horse with colic, and she spent 3 nights sleeping in his barn to monitor the animal's recovery. Xavier missed her terribly, a physical ache that surprised him with its intensity. When she returned, exhausted but triumphant because the horse had survived, he met her at her house with hot coffee and food. She collapsed into her chair with a grateful sigh. "I am getting too old to sleep in barns," she said, though her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. "You saved that man's horse. He told me it was his best breeding mare, worth more than most people earn in a year. I just did my job." But she smiled, accepting the compliment. Xavier knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "Marry me, Laura." She went very still, her eyes searching his face. "What? Marry me? I know we have only known each other 2 months, and I know I should probably wait longer, court you properly for a year or more. But I am 32 years old, and I know my own mind. I love you. I love your strength and your intelligence and the way you see the world. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. Xavier, people already talk about me enough. If we rush into marriage, they will say terrible things. They will say I trapped you or that I am not respectable. I do not care what they say. Do you love me?" She cupped his face in her hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, God help me, but yes, I love you. Then nothing else matters." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Doc Hendricks and his wife standing as witnesses. Laura wore a dress of deep blue wool, practical and beautiful, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. Xavier wore his best suit and felt his heart might burst when she walked down the aisle toward him. The preacher spoke about duty and obedience, the traditional words of a marriage ceremony, but Xavier barely heard them. He was too focused on Laura, on the way she met his eyes steadily, without fear or hesitation. When they spoke their vows, her voice was strong and sure. They held a small reception at the ranch, just a few close friends and neighbors who had shown them kindness. Mrs. Patterson from the general store brought a cake, and old Tom Wyatt played his fiddle while people danced in the yard. Laura laughed as Xavier spun her around, her face flushed with happiness. When everyone had finally gone home and they were alone in the house that was now theirs together, Laura looked around with satisfaction. "I have been thinking about where to set up my examining table. The spare room would be perfect, with good light from the east window. And we could build a proper surgery in part of the barn for larger animals." Xavier pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Whatever you need. This is your home now, too. We will make it work for both of us." She tilted her face up to kiss him, and in that moment, Xavier understood that he had found something rare and precious. Not a woman who would simply share his life, but a true partner, someone who would build a life alongside him. Their first winter together tested them in ways Xavier had not anticipated. Laura's practice grew as word spread of her skill, and she was often called away to ranches across the county. Xavier worried when she rode out alone in the cold, but he learned to trust her competence and her judgment. She always came back to him, sometimes exhausted and wind-blown, but always with stories of the animals she had helped and the people she had met. In turn, she supported him through the challenges of ranching. When a late freeze killed half his winter wheat, she helped him figure out how to recoup the losses. When one of his best cows developed milk fever, Laura saved her with a treatment Xavier had never heard of. They worked as a team, and the ranch began to prosper in ways it never had when Xavier worked alone. In February, a blizzard struck with little warning, dumping 2 feet of snow and driving the temperature well below freezing. Xavier and Laura worked around the clock to keep the livestock safe, breaking ice on water troughs, distributing extra hay, checking for frostbite and injury. On the second night, as they stumbled back to the house, half frozen and exhausted, they found a visitor. The doe stood in the shelter of the barn's overhang, her coat thick with winter fur. She looked healthy and strong, her legs showing no signs of the injury that had brought her into their lives. Laura stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. "Is that her?" Xavier asked, though he already knew the answer. "I think so. See the scar on her hindquarter, and the way she holds her left hind leg just slightly different from the right." They watched as the doe watched them, her ears flicking forward. She showed no fear, only a kind of calm recognition. Then, with a flick of her white tail, she bounded off into the snowy darkness. "She came back to check on us," Laura said, wonder in her voice. "Or maybe to say thank you." Xavier wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, drawing her close. Or maybe she just wanted to see the place where her life was saved. Inside, they thawed by the fire, drinking hot coffee and eating bread and cheese because they were too tired to cook. Laura leaned against Xavier's shoulder, and he felt the bone-deep satisfaction of a hard day's work done together. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up your house in town, tying yourself to a rancher's life?" Laura turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "Never. Not even for a moment. This is where I belong, Xavier. With you doing this work, I have never been happier." Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new calves. Laura delivered 3 of them when Xavier's heifers had trouble, working with patient skill to guide the babies safely into the world. She was magnificent in those moments, her hair coming loose from its braid, her sleeves rolled up, her entire being focused on the task at hand. In April, Laura told him she was pregnant. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink when she simply said, "I am going to have a baby." Xavier felt the world tilt slightly. "Are you sure?" "I am a doctor, Xavier. Yes, I am sure." Joy flooded through him, followed immediately by fear. "Are you all right? Is everything as it should be? Should you be resting? Maybe you should not be delivering calves and treating horses." Laura laughed, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "I am fine, and I will continue to work as long as I am able. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still living their lives. I will not become an invalid simply because I am pregnant." But she did make some concessions, allowing Xavier to take on the more physically demanding cases, accepting help more readily. Her practice continued to grow, and in May, she took on her first apprentice, a young man from town named Peter who wanted to learn veterinary medicine. Xavier built them a proper surgery in the barn, with good lighting and storage for supplies. The summer was hot and dry, and Xavier worried about his cattle. But Laura helped him devise a system of water distribution that kept the herd healthy even as other ranchers struggled. She was showing now, her belly rounding under her dresses, and Xavier found himself constantly amazed that they had created a new life together. In August, the doe appeared again, this time with twin fawns at her side. They came at dusk to drink from the stock tank, and Xavier and Laura watched from the porch, hardly daring to breathe. The fawns were spotted and leggy, still learning the ways of the world, and they stayed close to their mother's side. "She has a family now," Laura whispered. "Just like us." The thought filled Xavier with a contentment so complete it was almost painful. Everything he had ever wanted was here. A wife he loved beyond measure, a child on the way, land that sustained them, work that mattered. It seemed almost too good to be true, too perfect to
This
last.
story was
But it
posted on the
did
channel
last.
The Rusty Saddle. Please
In
do not
November,
repost it
on
in
a
any
clear,
form.
cold night with stars blazing overhead, Laura gave birth to their son. Xavier paced the bedroom floor while Doc Hendricks attended her, feeling more helpless than he ever had in his life. When he finally heard the baby's cry, thin and outraged and absolutely perfect, he burst into the room despite the doctor's protests. Laura lay propped against pillows, her hair dark with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny red-faced creature with a shock of dark hair. She looked up at Xavier with such love that he felt his throat close. "We have a son," she said. Xavier crossed to the bed, sitting carefully beside her and looking down at his child in wonder. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused dark blue eyes. Xavier reached out one finger and the baby's hand closed around it with surprising strength. "What shall we name him?" Laura asked. They had discussed names for months, making lists and discarding them, never quite finding the right one. But looking at his son now, Xavier knew exactly what it should be. "James," he said. "James Irving. A good, strong name for a good, strong boy." Laura smiled. "James, I like it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world." The first year of James's life was a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry, but also of joy beyond anything Xavier had imagined. He loved watching Laura with their son, the tenderness in her touch, the songs she sang while rocking him. He loved the weight of the baby in his own arms, the trust in those dark eyes. Laura returned to work when James was 6 weeks old, though she took him with her on house calls, carrying him in a sling against her chest. The sight of a woman veterinarian had been shocking enough to the conservative folks of Truth or Consequences. A woman veterinarian with a baby was beyond scandalous. But Laura ignored the talk, and gradually people grew accustomed to the sight of her arriving with James bundled against her, ready to treat whatever animal needed help. In the spring, when James was 6 months old, Xavier expanded his herd significantly. The winter had been mild, his cattle had thrived, and he had saved enough to purchase additional breeding stock. Laura helped him select the animals, using her trained eye to spot the healthiest specimens. The ranch was becoming more profitable than it had ever been under his father's management. One afternoon in May, Xavier was mending fence in the north pasture when he heard Laura calling his name. He turned to see her running toward him, James bouncing in his sling, her face alight with excitement. "Xavier, come quickly. You have to see this." He dropped his tools and followed her to the house, where she led him to the window overlooking the vegetable garden. There, bold as you please, the doe stood with her yearling twins, now nearly grown. But that was not what made Laura's eyes shine. Playing around the adult's legs was a new fawn, tiny and perfect, with the same distinctive markings as its grandmother. "She brought her whole family," Laura breathed. "3 generations, Xavier. She is showing them that this is a safe place." Xavier wrapped his arms around his wife and son, watching the deer graze peacefully in the garden that Laura had worked so hard to grow. He should probably shoo them away, should protect his vegetables. But he found he could not bring himself to do it. This place was safe, for deer and humans alike, and he wanted to keep it that way. James turned 1 year old in November, and they marked the occasion with a small party. Peter, Laura's apprentice, came with his new wife. Doc Hendricks and Mrs. Patterson attended, along with a handful of neighbors who had become friends. James toddled around on his new walking legs, delighted with the attention and the cake Laura had baked. As Xavier watched his son laugh and play, watched his wife chat easily with their guests, he felt a deep sense of rightness. This was what life was meant to be, filled with love and work and community, built on a foundation of trust and partnership. That winter brought challenges. A particularly harsh cold snap killed several calves, and Laura worked herself to exhaustion trying to save as many as possible. Xavier worried about her, about the toll the work took, but he also understood that asking her to stop would be like asking her to stop breathing. This was who she was, and he loved her for it. In February, she told him she was pregnant again. This time, Xavier felt more prepared, less terrified. He had been through this once and knew they could manage whatever came. Laura continued to work throughout her pregnancy, though she did agree to let Peter handle more of the overnight emergencies. Their daughter was born in October of 1881, a smaller baby than James had been, with Laura's blonde hair and Xavier's dark eyes. They named her Rose after Xavier's mother, and she was a calm, easy baby who seemed content to simply observe the world around her. With 2 children now, life became more complicated but also richer. James, at nearly 2, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Laura managed her practice and motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else, though Xavier noticed the dark circles under her eyes and insisted on hiring a young woman from town to help with the children a few hours each day. The ranch continued to prosper. Xavier's herd grew, and he began selling breeding stock to other ranchers, developing a reputation for healthy, hardy cattle. Laura's practice was now the busiest in the county, and she had taken on a second apprentice, a young woman named Sarah who had come all the way from Kansas to study with her. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1882, Xavier and Laura sat on the porch while James chased chickens in the yard and Rose slept in her cradle. The doe appeared at the edge of the clearing, now with a new fawn at her side. She had become a regular visitor over the years, a living reminder of how their lives had been brought together. "You remember the day I first saw you?" Xavier asked, his hand finding Laura's. "You were covered in dust from the road, and you looked absolutely desperate. I almost turned you away because I thought you were going to ask me to do something impossible." "It was impossible. Wild deer do not usually survive captivity and treatment. You worked a miracle." Laura shook her head. "No miracle, just knowledge and care and a little bit of luck." The doe did most of the work herself. She wanted to live. She brought us together, though. If I had not found her that day, I never would have met you. You would have met me eventually. Truth or consequences is not that big a town. Maybe. But I might not have had a reason to really see you to know you. That doe gave me that. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to help her. Best decision I ever made, saying yes." Laura leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play and the deer graze, and the sun move slowly across the Texas sky. The years that followed brought their share of joys and sorrows. In 1883, Laura lost a patient for the first time in months, a horse that developed tetanus after a wound infection. She came home devastated, and Xavier held her while she cried, knowing that her grief came from caring so deeply. The next day, she returned to work, determined to learn from the loss. James grew into a bright, curious boy who loved animals as much as his mother did. By the time he was 4, he was already helping Laura in her surgery, learning the names of instruments and how to hold a horse steady during treatment. Rose was quieter but no less interested, spending hours watching her mother work with silent, serious eyes. In 1884, Xavier's herd was struck by a disease that killed a dozen cattle before Laura identified it and developed a treatment. Her quick action saved the rest, and word spread throughout the county. After that, ranchers who had once scoffed at the idea of a woman veterinarian began seeking her out specifically, trusting her expertise
This
over
story
that
was
of any
posted
man.
on the channel The
The
Rusty
ranch
Saddle.
expanded
Please do
again.
not repost it in any form.
Xavier purchased the neighboring property when old Tom Wyatt decided to retire and move to San Antonio to live with his daughter. The additional land allowed him to double his herd, and he hired 2 cowboys to help with the work. The house got an addition as well, 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, because Laura insisted she needed space for her books and medical journals. In the spring of 1885, Laura discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder. She was tired in a way she had not been before, and there were complications that worried Doc Hendricks. Xavier wanted her to rest completely, but Laura refused to abandon her patients. They compromised. She would only take cases close to home and would let Peter and Sarah handle anything that required overnight stays. Their second son was born in December, a long and difficult labor that left Laura weak and exhausted. But the baby was healthy, a large, loud child with a full head of red hair that surprised them both. They named him Thomas, and Xavier took 2 weeks away from ranch work to care for Laura and the other children while she recovered. It was during this time that the doe appeared one last time. She was older now, her muzzle graying, her movements a bit slower. She stood in the yard at twilight, and Xavier brought Laura to the window to see her. They watched as the deer looked toward the house, her ears forward, and then turned and walked slowly into the trees. "She is saying goodbye," Laura whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I think she came to say goodbye." They never saw the doe again. Xavier liked to imagine she lived out her days peacefully, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, leaving behind a legacy of survival and wildness. Like Laura had done, in her own way, carving out a place for herself in a world that had not wanted to make room. By 1886, the Irving Ranch was one of the most successful in the county. Xavier employed 4 permanent hands and hired additional help during Roundup. Laura's practice had grown to the point where she had 3 apprentices working under her, and she was writing articles for veterinary journals back east, sharing her knowledge and techniques. James was 7 now, already helping with the cattle and showing a natural talent for working with animals. Rose was 5, quieter than her brother but equally competent, and Thomas was a sturdy toddler who followed his siblings everywhere. The house was full of noise and laughter and life. On their 8th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Laura with a trip to Galveston, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson and Peter. They spent 3 days walking on the beach, eating fresh seafood, and simply being alone together for the first time in years. On their last evening, they stood on the shore watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. Laura leaned against Xavier's chest, his arms wrapped around her waist. "Have you been happy?" he asked. "Truly happy." "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered without hesitation. "I have work that fulfills me, children that I love, and a husband who has never once asked me to be anything other than who I am. What more could anyone want? I just want to make sure I am giving you enough, that this life is not too small for you." She turned in his arms to face him. "Xavier Irving, listen to me. This life is not small, it is full and rich and meaningful. We have built something together, a true partnership. We help people and animals, we raise our children, we make a difference in our community. That is not small. That is everything." He kissed her then, tasting salt air and promise, and knew that she was right. What they had built together was extraordinary, not because it was grand or glamorous, but because it was real and lasting and filled with love. They returned to truth or consequences, to to find that James had helped Peter deliver a calf and Rose had organized the entire pantry, and Thomas had somehow managed to get himself stuck in a barrel in the barn, but was perfectly fine. Life continued in all its chaotic beauty. In 1887, Laura was asked to speak at a veterinary conference in Dallas, the first woman ever invited to do so. Xavier encouraged her to go, managing the children and the ranch while she was away. She came back energized, full of new ideas and techniques she had learned, connections she had made with other professionals. The ranch faced a crisis in the summer of 1888 when a drought struck hard, drying up water sources and withering the grass. Xavier had to make the difficult decision to sell off part of his herd, keeping only the strongest animals. It was heartbreaking, the work of years diminished, but Laura helped him through it. "We will rebuild," she told him on the worst day, when he sat in the barn with his head in his hands. "We have done it before, and we will do it again. We are stronger together than any drought." She was right. By the following spring, the rains returned, and Xavier began slowly rebuilding his herd. Laura's income from her practice helped sustain them during the lean times, and Xavier was grateful beyond words for her skill and dedication. In 1889, James announced that he wanted to be a veterinarian like his mother. Laura's face lit up with pride, and she began teaching him more seriously, showing him how to diagnose illnesses, how to treat wounds, how to understand the language of animals. Xavier watched them work together and saw the future. A family practice, perhaps, with the Jensen name continued through skill rather than just blood. Rose surprised them by showing an aptitude for numbers and business. At 8 years old, she was already helping Xavier keep his accounts, spotting errors and suggesting ways to improve profitability. Thomas, at 4, was still young, but he showed every sign of being a natural horseman, completely fearless around even the largest animals. On a cold November evening in 1890, as they approached their 12th anniversary, Xavier and Laura sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. Laura was mending a shirt and Xavier was reviewing the next day's work, but mostly they were just enjoying the quiet companionship of each other's presence. "You ever think about that doe?" Laura asked suddenly. Xavier looked up, surprised. "Sometimes." "Why?" "I was just remembering how she looked that first day, so broken and scared, and how she kept coming back year after year, bringing her family. It is funny how one small act of kindness can ripple outward like that." "You saved her life." "We saved her life," Laura corrected. "You were the one who could not bring yourself to put her down, who cared enough to come find me. That is what started everything." Xavier set aside his papers and crossed to where Laura sat, kneeling beside her chair. "That doe brought me to you, and you gave me a life I never dreamed I could have. 3 beautiful children, a successful ranch, a partnership that makes me better than I could ever be alone. I do not believe in fate exactly, but I believe that finding that wounded deer was the luckiest day of my life." Laura set down her mending and cupped his face in her hands. "I love you, Xavier Irving, more now than the day we married, if that is even possible." "It is possible," he said, covering her hands with his own, "because I feel exactly the same way." They sat together in the firelight, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built something beautiful from that chance beginning. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, but inside there was warmth and love and the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came next together. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. In 1892, Laura published a book on veterinary techniques for ranch animals, which became a standard reference throughout Texas. She was invited to consult on difficult cases across the state, though she always made sure to be home for important family moments. James began his formal veterinary training at 16, apprenticing with his mother, but also corresponding with veterinarians in other cities, building his knowledge. Rose helped Xavier expand his business interests, investing in a small freight company that transported cattle to market. Thomas, at 8, was already working with the ranch horses, training young colts with a patience and skill that reminded Xavier of Laura. In 1894, they faced another loss when Doc Hendricks passed away peacefully in his sleep. He had become a good friend over the years, one of the few people who had never questioned Laura's right to practice her profession. They attended his funeral with the whole family, and Laura gave a eulogy that had half the church in tears. But life moved forward, as it always did.
This story was
In
posted on the channel The
1895,
Rusty Saddle.
James
Please do
completed
not
his
repost
training
it in
and
any
officially
form.
joined Laura's practice as a full partner. At 20, he was already gaining a reputation as a skilled veterinarian in his own right. They built a new surgery on the property, larger and better equipped than the old one, with space for both of them to work. Rose, at 14, announced that she wanted to attend a business college in Dallas. Xavier was initially hesitant, reluctant to let his daughter go so far away, but Laura convinced him to let her pursue her dreams. Rose thrived in Dallas, coming home during breaks full of ideas and energy. In 1897, on a spring morning that reminded Xavier of the day he had found the wounded doe 19 years earlier, he and Laura rode out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. They were both in their mid-50s now, with silver threading through their hair and lines around their eyes earned through years of laughter and work and life. As they rode, they spotted a young doe at the edge of the tree line, watching them with calm, dark eyes. She looked remarkably like the deer they had saved all those years ago, the same delicate build, the same intelligent gaze. "You think?" Laura asked quietly. "Maybe," Xavier said. "Maybe a great-granddaughter or great-great-granddaughter, the line continuing just like ours." They sat on their horses, watching the deer, and Xavier felt the weight of years settling on him like a comfortable blanket. He had built a good life, a lasting legacy. His children were grown and capable, following their own paths. His ranch was prosperous. His wife was still his best friend and greatest love. "No regrets?" Laura asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Not a single one," Xavier answered honestly. Only that we cannot live it all over again." She smiled at him, her face still beautiful despite the years. "But then again, we have had a wonderful first time around." They rode home together through the spring morning, side by side as they had been for nearly 2 decades, and Xavier knew that whatever time they had left, they would face it the same way. Together, with love and courage and the quiet strength that came from building something real. In 1899, Rose returned from Dallas with a degree in business and immediately began helping Xavier modernize his operations. She implemented new record-keeping systems, negotiated better contracts with buyers, and increased profits by 20% in the first year alone. She also brought home a young man named Daniel Morrison, a fellow student who had followed her to Texas because he had fallen hopelessly in love with her. Xavier approved of him immediately, seeing in Daniel the same kind of steady competence he valued in himself. They were married in the spring of 1900, in the same church where Xavier and Laura had exchanged vows 22 years earlier. Rose wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit the new fashions, and Laura cried through the entire ceremony. Afterward, Daniel joined the family business, working alongside Rose to expand the ranch's operations. Thomas, at 16, announced that he wanted to focus entirely on horse breeding. Xavier gave him a portion of the ranch land and helped him build proper stables. Within 2 years, Thomas was producing horses that were sought after throughout Texas, known for their intelligence, endurance, and even temperament. James married Sarah, Laura's former apprentice who had stayed in Truth or Consequences and become a partner in the practice. Their wedding in 1901 was a joyful affair, and Laura gained not just a daughter-in-law but a colleague she already loved and respected. James and Sarah built a house on the ranch property, close enough for easy collaboration but far enough for privacy. In 1902, Laura and Xavier became grandparents for the first time when James and Sarah welcomed a son they named Matthew. Xavier held his grandson and felt the profound satisfaction of seeing his family extend into another generation. This child would grow up surrounded by love and opportunity, would learn the value of hard work and the importance of kindness, just as his father had. Rose and Daniel's daughter arrived the following year, a red-haired firecracker they named Catherine. Thomas, always the most independent of the children, seemed in no hurry to marry, content with his horses and his work. Laura told Xavier not to worry, that Thomas would find his path in his own time. As they entered the new century, Xavier looked around at what they had built and felt deeply content. The ranch sprawled across thousands of acres now, supporting not just his family but several others who worked the land. Laura's veterinary practice had trained dozens of students, spreading her knowledge across the state. Their children were happy and successful, building lives that honored the values they had been taught. On their 25th wedding anniversary in November 1903, Xavier organized a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by their family. The house was full of people, laughter, and stories. Old Mrs. Patterson was there, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack. Peter had his own practice in a neighboring county, but came with his wife and 5 children. Former apprentices attended, along with ranchers whose animals Laura had saved, townspeople who had overcome their initial prejudices to become friends. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Xavier found Laura on the porch, looking out at the land they had worked together for so long. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh. "Happy anniversary, my love," he murmured into her hair. "Happy anniversary, 25 years. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like forever. Other days like no time at all." Laura turned in his arms to face him. "If you could go back to that day in September 1878, when you found that wounded doe, would you change anything?" Xavier thought about it seriously, considering the years of struggle and challenge, the losses and difficulties they had faced. Then he looked into his wife's eyes and knew the answer with absolute certainty. Not a single thing. Every moment, good and bad, brought us here. To this life, this family, this love, I would not trade any of it. She kissed him then, a kiss that held 25 years of partnership and passion, of growth and understanding, of choosing each other every single day. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "We should go back inside," Laura said. "We still have guests. Or we could stay out here a bit longer, just the two of us, and watch the stars." She laughed. "Always the romantic, even after all these years." "Only with you," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They stood together on the porch of their home, surrounded by the life they had built, and looked up at the vast Texas sky. Somewhere in the darkness, deer moved through the trees, following paths worn by generations. The land continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to human joy and sorrow, yet somehow made more meaningful by the love and work of those who tended it. Xavier thought about that wounded doe, the creature whose suffering had brought Laura into his life. She had been healed and had lived, had raised her young and passed on her legacy. In helping her, they had helped themselves, had found the path to their own healing and happiness. It seemed almost like a miracle, how one small moment could change everything. But Xavier had learned over the years that life was full of such moments, if you had the courage to recognize them and the wisdom to act. Finding that doe had been one moment. Asking Laura for help
This
had been
story was
another.
posted on the channel The Rusty
Every
Saddle.
day since
Please
had
do
been
not
filled with
repost it in
small
any
choices
form.
that either strengthened their bond or could have weakened it. And they had chosen strength, chosen love, chosen each other. The future stretched ahead, unknown and full of possibility. Their children would continue to grow and build their own legacies. Grandchildren would come, bringing new joy and new challenges. The ranch would evolve, adapting to changing times while holding fast to the values that had made it strong. Laura's work would influence generations of veterinarians, her methods and her compassion spreading far beyond truth or consequences. But right now, in this moment, Xavier was content to simply stand with his wife under the stars, grateful beyond measure for the life they shared. He had been a lonely cowboy working land that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Laura had been a woman alone, brilliant and capable but isolated by society's narrow expectations. Together, they had become something more than either could have been alone. They had built a family, a business, a legacy of compassion and competence. They had loved each other through good times and bad, had weathered storms both literal and figurative, and had emerged stronger for it. "What are you thinking about?" Laura asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "Everything," Xavier answered. "The past, the present, the future, mostly how lucky I am." "We are lucky," she corrected gently. "Both of us. We found each other against all odds. A wounded doe brought us together. Love kept us together." She was right, as she so often was. The doe had been the catalyst, but what came after had been their choice, their commitment, their daily decision to honor the bond they had formed. That was the real miracle, not the chance meeting but the deliberate building of a life together. Inside, they could hear their children's voices, the sound of their grandchildren playing. The house was warm and full of life, a testament to what two people could create when they worked together in love and trust. This was their legacy, more valuable than any amount of money or land. A family built on partnership and respect, children who knew how to love and work and dream. Xavier pulled Laura close one more time, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. 25 years of marriage, and he still felt his heart skip when she smiled at him. 25 years of waking beside her, and it still felt like the greatest gift he had ever received. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day, perhaps even more so because they were earned through years of proving them in action. "I love you too," Laura replied, and in those simple words was the story of their life together. Every moment of joy and struggle, every laugh and tear, every sunrise they had watched together and every sunset still to come. They went back inside to their family, to the celebration that continued in their honor. But Xavier carried with him the memory of that quiet moment under the stars, another small moment of grace to add to the thousands they had collected over the years. The party continued late into the night, and when everyone had finally gone home or settled into guest rooms, Xavier and Laura climbed the stairs to their bedroom, tired but happy. As they prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine of 25 years together, Xavier caught sight of their reflection in the mirror. Two people no longer young, marked by time and work but still strong, still vital, still together. "Do you remember what you said the first day you came to look at the doe?" Xavier asked as they settled into bed. Laura thought for a moment. I said a lot of things that day. You said that animals were honest in a way people often were not. That if you treated them with skill and kindness, they responded in kind. I remember. I still believe it is true. I think it applies to people too, Xavier said quietly. At least it has applied to us. We have been honest with each other, and we have treated each other with skill and kindness. And we have built something beautiful because of it. Laura turned to him, her eyes bright even in the dim lamplight. We have we not? Something real and lasting. The most real thing I have ever known, Xavier agreed. They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done thousands of times before, secure in the knowledge that they would wake together and face another day as partners. The house settled around them, full of the gentle sounds of family and home. Outside, the Texas night enfolded the ranch in darkness, and somewhere in the hills, deer moved silently through the scrub, living their wild lives in the shadow of human habitation. The years that remained to Xavier and Laura were good ones, full of the simple pleasures of watching their family grow and their legacy take root. They worked together until age finally forced them to slow down, passing the ranch to their children and the veterinary practice to James and Sarah. They became the wise elders of the family, dispensing advice and stories, playing with grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other, their love deepening with each passing year. They had been forged together through shared trials and triumphs, and nothing could break that bond. When Xavier died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78 in 1924, Laura held his hand and told him she would see him soon. She followed him 6 months later, having lived a full and meaningful life that had touched countless people and animals. Their children buried them side by side in the cemetery at Truth or Consequences, under a sky as wide and blue as the one they had loved. The ranch continued under family management for generations, and the veterinary practice that Laura had founded trained practitioners well into the 20th century. Their great-grandchildren told stories about the cowboy who could not bear to kill a wounded deer and the woman who came to save it and ended up saving him instead. But the true story was not about a single act of mercy or a chance meeting. It was about two people who chose each other, who built a life together on foundations of respect and partnership, who proved that love sustained by honesty and kindness could weather any storm. It was about a family that grew from that love, spreading outward like ripples on water, touching more lives than Xavier and Laura could ever have imagined. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moved through the grass and the sun painted the sky in shades of gold, people claimed to see deer moving through the old Irving property, graceful and wild and free. Whether they were descendants of that long-ago doe or simply other members of her kind, no one could say. But their presence was a reminder that small acts of compassion could have consequences that echoed through generations, that choosing kindness over convenience could change not just one life but many. Xavier and Laura's story became part of the land itself, woven into the history of Truth or Consequences and the surrounding country. It was told and retold, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the same essential truth. That love built on partnership and mutual respect was the strongest force in the world, capable of transforming lives and creating legacies that outlasted any individual lifespan. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the values they had embodied, treating their work and their relationships with the same dedication and care. The ranch prospered through changing times, adapting while holding fast to its core principles. The veterinary tradition continued, with family members choosing that path generation after generation, inspired by Laura's pioneering example. And so the story came full circle, from a wounded deer and two lonely people to a thriving family and a lasting legacy. It was a story of healing and hope, of finding light in unexpected places, of the transformative power of love freely given. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of story that should come from the meeting of a cowboy who could not bear to kill, and a woman who devoted her life to healing.
This story was
Two
posted on the
souls who
channel
found
The
in each
Rusty
other
Saddle.
everything they
Please do
had been
not
looking
repost it
for
in any
without
form.
even knowing they were searching. The land remembered them. The family remembered them. And somewhere in the hills around Truth or Consequences, Texas, the descendants of a doe they had saved so long ago still ran free, living testaments to the enduring power of compassion.